Welcome back everyone, it's Eric from Eric Candy, and today I'm actually going to be going over my tournament report for the recent regional that was just held in Madison, Wisconsin. At the time of filming, I just got back home like a day ago, so I wanted to do a tournament report while everything was still kind of fresh in my mind. That way I can recall like my matchups and things like that for you guys. So of course in this tournament report we'll be going over my deck list, the exact 60 I used for this event, my matchups throughout the day, etc. And this event was actually kind of an important one because I did have to miss a lot of major events kind of at the beginning of the season. Like I had to miss, I think, the first two regionals, and I think I didn't play in any cups or challenges for quarter one as well. So as far as championship points go, I've actually been a little bit behind the season. Prior to this event, I was sitting at 460, and you need 550 to get to Worlds this season. So a lot of pressure on at this point in the season to kind of scrape together those last championship points I need to get to Worlds, which was not a fun feeling going into this event, but nevertheless, I kind of liked going into this event just because I don't know if you guys have heard me speak about prior regionals, but the metagame was actually a bit well defined for this, which is something I really do like at a regional, especially when I am desperately trying to get championship points. So that's definitely a good thing for this event that we had. So of course though, the format for this event was standard format. We now have Unbroken Bonds in the mix, and like I mentioned, I think the metagame's kind of been somewhat well defined at this point. We've already had a few regionals featuring these new cards. So of course the big ones that got thrown into the mix are going to be most notably the new Reshiram Charizard GX and all of the fire support that kind of came with it. But of course we also got a bunch of new cards from Unbroken Bonds that just help the engines of other decks in general, like the new Greens Exploration, we got Pokegear, Lieutenant Surge's Strategy, so a bunch of new cards got thrown into the mix here with Unbroken Bonds. But of course, like I said, the fire stuff is going to be the most notable stuff that's really going to impact this format. And that was definitely what I expected to see the most of going into this regional. We've already had two other regionals and a special event that have been held, in this new format. And it's been pretty clear Reshiram Charizard GX is an absolute powerhouse. And it's just been dominating all of the tournaments it's been legal for. So that was definitely the big new deck that's been injected into this metagame ever since Team Up was around. But of course we still have a lot of fan favorites from before. We still have Zoroark lingering around. No matter what happens, it seems like Zoroark just always persists just because of how strong that trade ability is, of course. Pikachu Zekrom still a pretty formidable deck in this format. It did get hit with the new Mew, which is a popular tech in a lot of decks. But nevertheless, Pikachu Zekrom, it's still a very hard-hitting deck, and one I expected to see in some capacity. Of course, we also still had Zapdos, the other big lightning archetype, running around, and we've seen a couple of different variants pop up at recent events in this format. We've seen kind of standard Zapdos decks, we've seen more fighting variants, we've seen Ultra Beast variants, but nevertheless Zapdos just in general as an archetype is still pretty powerful and one I expected to see. And of course we did have some new other decks from Unbroken Bonds make a bit of a splash at other recent events, most notably probably the new Weezing and the new Lucario Melmetal GX, or just stall decks in general. We also saw like an Oranguru Shed Engine deck, but just in general stall decks have kind of made a resurgence, and Weezing has also been a pretty popular deck, especially online lately as well. So that's kind of what I expected to see coming into this event. There's still some other decks that could see like more fringe play, like Malamar just as an example, or even the Baby Blacephalon. So those were of course still kind of in the back of my mind, but these are definitely the big ones I kind of had in mind when helping select a deck choice for this event. And that of course begs the question too, how did I arrive at my deck choice for this event here? And I kind of knew just right off the bat, I really wasn't too interested in playing Reshiram Charizard GX, even though it probably is like the undisputed best deck in format. Just never been a big fan of like the playstyle of those types of decks. Also, you're bound to hit a ton of mirror matches throughout your day, and that just sounded like such an absolute bore for like a 9-round tournament. So I kind of ruled out pretty early on, I didn't want to play Reshiram Charizard. It's always kind of a backup just in case, because I do own the cards to play it. But despite its strength, just playing 9 rounds of the deck just did not seem enjoyable whatsoever to me. So I kind of started looking at some other decks for this event. One of the big ones that was probably my front runner for the longest time was actually the new Vikavolt. This was a card that I did a little bit of early testing with here on the channel. We had kind of an early deck profile several weeks ago before the set dropped, and it was a card, even in kind of the early stages of me developing the archetype in that old video, I could tell the deck was still really strong. And despite being a stage 2, I think really had a place in this metagame. Electric Cannon can take big one-hit knockouts and all these GXs running around, making it, I think, actually a pretty great attacker. And I had a ton of hours logged in with this thing. I've tried a variety of different builds. But as much as I've enjoyed playing this archetype and kind of refining this deck, over the past month, ever since Unbroken Bonds came out, it's still a stage 2 deck, and there's just so many games where I would just get let loose into nothing and just lose. Just because you're a stage 2 deck, you have a ton of moving pieces that are kind of floating around in your deck at all times. And I knew that, I really wanted some championship points from this event. So I wanted a deck that was at least a bit more consistent than the Vikavolt deck. So even though I did kind of cross it off my list, this was honestly my favorite deck I've been playing for this format. It's one of the few stage 2s that actually can kind of go toe to toe with some of these big, hard hitting GX and tag team Pokemon that we have. So it was kind of bittersweet crossing it off my list, but I knew I didn't want to play something that was very, very inconsistent. So that ultimately led me to Weezing. This was another deck that I had been testing a bit after the set dropped, and kind of, I think, caught a lot of people off guard by how good the card actually was. I think very early on when Unbroken Bonds was first coming out, it kind of looked like just kind of an okay card. Even in our set review, we weren't too enthusiastic about it. But after I got in some games with this thing, I became much more impressed, and we actually saw Weezing do fairly well at some of the major recent events held in this format. So Weezing, I definitely thought, was a pretty good contender as well. It can handle all of the big basic decks like the tag teams and Zapdos decks, pretty easily. It definitely struggles a lot against like the control style decks that are out there. But again, if you just wind up hitting a bunch of Reshizards and Zapdos decks all day, then Weezing is actually a pretty decent play. I was kind of worried going into this event just because Weezing was now on people's radar after kind of popping up at the past several events. I was kind of worried that people might be a little bit more well prepared for it, which was one of the things that was turning me off of the deck a little bit. But ultimately, I did decide on Weezing nonetheless. I thought it was a bit more consistent than Vikavolt. Your plays, I think, are relatively straightforward with the deck. And even though just in general, people, I think, are very aware of Weezing, there's a variety of different tech options that you can play that can still catch your opponent off guard. So even though things like Field Blower were starting to slide back in people's decks, I still felt relatively confident in the deck. It's not a type of deck that I thought would get me all the way to the finals of day 2, but it's one I thought would do well enough to at least get me some championship points. And that's kind of my goal here. I just need to get some amount of championship points from whatever events I go to. It'd be nice to win, but really, as long as I can scrape together points from every event, that's really my top priority right now. So that's ultimately why I did settle on Weezing. So let's take a look here at the list that I did use for this event. Overall, I'd say it's fairly standard. A lot of things in here will look very familiar to anyone who has been, looking at some of the results from recent major events and Weezing lists that have been posted. But of course, the tech options are really, I think, what set people's lists apart with the Weezing deck, because most of it is going to be very much the same. You have your shrines, your spell tags, things like that. And just to briefly recap on Weezing 2, if you guys aren't too familiar with the card, has this ability: if it's your active Pokemon in between turns, put 1 damage counter on each of your opponent's basic Pokemon. And then its primary attack for a DCE does 40 and 20 to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon that already has damage counters on them. So it's a spread deck. You have a couple of copies of Tapu Koko in here as well, which can sometimes get down some early damage counters to set up your splattering sludge attack. But overall, we're just trying to do a bunch of residual damage and, kind of play from behind with things like counter energy as well, since we aren't taking big one-hit knockouts most of the time. And we're just trying to, hit a bunch of the tag teams and basic decks in the format and try to get our wins that way. So let's take a look at some of the techs that I opted for in this deck. So one of the big ones I'm going to point out really quick is going to be the Honchkrow from Guardians Rising. So we don't play the Murkrow in this deck, which is something I did want, but I just could not find space for it. We play the one Ditto Prism Star, which can, of course, become a Weezing if we want it to, but also we have the flexibility of evolving into Honchkrow, which does 10 plus 10 more for every damage counter on your opponent's side of the field. So this is sometimes a really, really good cleanup attacker, like in the late game, if you have a bunch of damaged Pokemon on your opponent's side of the field, but you just need to take prizes quickly to end the game. Honchkrow is actually a really, really good attacker for that type of situation. I used it pretty decently throughout the weekend, and I have to say I didn't really miss the Murkrow like I thought I would. So the 0-1 Honchkrow line actually felt pretty decent overall. It's especially good against like decks like Reshizard or maybe even like Zapdos or Pikarom, where kind of late in the game, once they only have 1 or 2 prizes left, they usually try to pivot into like a big tanky GX that you can't really knock out quickly. So Honchkrow is really good at kind of stopping those types of plays, which is something I did like about the card. So that's one of the main techs I want to point out. We also have the Larvitar from Lost Thunder that can hit Fighting Weak Pokemon for 160 if they have 3 damage counters on them. So 160 is factoring in the weakness as well. So a lot of the Reshiram Charizard decks have been playing EV Snorlax GX. Of course, we still have Zoroark GX in the format, Pikarom, Zeraora GX. There's a lot of fighting weak stuff, and it's really easy to set up the attack on the Larvitar. So really good tech here. Also, Frost Rotom, this is a card I actually put in kind of last minute, just because I think most of the Charizard players kind of know how to play around Weezing at this point. I don't think any good player is really going to overbench against this deck. So I want to have the Frost Rotom as an option to potentially take a big one-hit knockout on some Reshizards at some point, especially if they are limiting their bench size. Let's see, we also have a Mew. This is going to be primarily for the mirror match and also for Pikachu Zekrom GX. But surprisingly, Mew is actually a pretty good attacker even outside of the utility that it normally gives you with its bench barrier ability. The attack on it's just a colorless energy, and you put 3 damage counters anywhere you want. So even if you start the Mew sometimes, it's really good at actually setting up splattering sludge damage for later in the game. Especially if you are playing against an evolution deck or something like that. You can get down those damage counters, that way Splattering Sludge can still hit them even once they've evolved. And then just a couple of like draw support Pokemon like a Rangaroo and Marshadow to round out the list. Like I said, I think the big differentiating factor for most of the different Weezing lists out there is going to be your choice of tech Pokemon. I think the big one that I really wouldn't mind putting in here at some point is going to be the Mr. Mime that prevents Acerolas, just because I think Weezing honestly is going to struggle against the Zoroark variants. And if you have the Mr. Mime, that is going to force them to set up in a Alolan Muck if they want to get around your Mr. Mime. And Alolan Muck is also weak to Psychic, so you can actually pick it off at some point, even if they do manage to set it up. But being able to deny your opponent's Ace rolls is going to be really, really huge. And I think that's one of the only ways you can actually win that matchup. So I was very fortunate enough, as you'll see, I did not play against any Zoroark during my day 1 tournament run. But had I been paired against any, I think I would have preferred to have a Mr. Mime in this list. Not really sure what I would cut. Maybe cut the Honchkrow. I think that's one of the main tech Pokemon I would kind of get rid of. Maybe even the Mew. It's hard to say. It's a pretty tight list. There's just so many different techs that you need to deal with a lot of different things out there. It's kind of hard to figure out, what you want to cut here. But overall, I was really happy with this list. It performed pretty well. I had a couple games every now and again where I would dead draw and just get benched out. But overall, the deck was pretty consistent throughout my tournament run. So let's head into my matchups, and I'll take you through how my actual tournament run went. So round 1, right off the bat, I get paired against Reshiram and Charizard GX. This is definitely a matchup I was hoping to hit, and hopefully multiple times throughout this event as well. I think this is definitely a good matchup for the Weezing deck, generally speaking. Now, of course, there are some different techs they could potentially play that would kind of mess me up. If they play Acerola, if they play Max Potion, if they play Miltank, if they play Field Blower or multiple copies of Field Blower, these are all ways they can actually even this matchup up quite a bit. And I don't really remember too much about this first round. I do remember in our first game, my opponent just had an answer to like everything I tried to do, and I didn't actually even get up a Weezing and even ever like Splattering Sludge. So I think I scooped it up after my opponent took a couple prizes, and so I end up winning the remaining 2 matches. I don't really remember what happened though, unfortunately, so I apologize about that, but I did wind up winning round 1, which felt really nice. Going on to round 2, hit yet again another Reshiram Charizard deck. So yet again, pretty stoked on the matchup that I hit here. From what I remember, I think all of our games were relatively close. Game 2, I do remember I did have a pretty crucial whiff at one point. My opponent had an EV Snorlax they had been attacking with, and it was pretty heavily damaged. And all I needed was an energy to be able to knock it out with my Larvitar. So I Cynthia'd, I whiffed the energy, and I had to knock it out via, I think, a Frost Rotom, actually, if I remember correctly. But that was really bad because I needed to actually save the Frost Rotom for a return knockout on the following turn. And as a result, that one turn whiffing the knockout with the correct attacker put my opponent literally just like 1 turn ahead of me to be able to win the game. And then I honestly did not expect game 3 to even finish because we had taken up a good chunk of time on both these games. But my opponent starts with a Mars Shadow, and they have just kind of a very clunky start, and all they end up having in play is a Turtonator and a Mars Shadow. So I Guzma up Turtonator, I believe, and Splattering Sludge, and then my opponent didn't have any way to get any other Pokemon in play or anything like that, and I was able to actually knock out both Pokemon at the same time with Weezing, benching out my opponent and taking game 3, like kind of stealing a game 3. It's not very usual that a big like 270 HP attacking deck like a Reshizard gets benched out, but I kind of had a little bit of luck there. But you know what? We're 2-0 at this point in the day. Definitely feels good to start the day off like this. You don't want to take your losses early on in the day because it really puts a lot of pressure on you to win out the rest of the day, which is never a fun feeling. Round 3, I get paired against a Pikachu Zekrom deck. This is another matchup I was very happy to see. I think this is definitely going to be a pretty favorable matchup for me. I play the Mew so I can actually get around Tagbolt GX as well and deny, multiple knockouts from my opponent. Game 1, however, I had absolutely nothing. I opened with, I believe it was like a lone Tapu Koko and a Larvitar, and I draw pass for 2 turns and just get benched out, which was very unfortunate because, again, I think this is a good matchup for my deck. And we go on to a game 2. And throughout the course of this game, I do discover my opponent plays 2 Field Blower and a Stealthy Hood, which is, a pretty big problem because one of the ways this Weezing deck is so good is because things like Shrine of Punishment and, of course, Spell Tags. That's going to be the big thing. Spell Tags is going to allow you to get some extra damage counters in play every time your opponent takes a knockout. And so my opponent was able to blower every time that I had the Spell Tags. And like I mentioned, he had the Stealthy Hood, which, when attached to a Pokemon, it prevents abilities done to them. So that means my Detention Gas won't work on whatever Pokemon it's attached to. So they had a ton of answers for this Weezing deck. And it still was very close. At the end of the game, all I needed was the Psychic Tapu Lele and a Counter Energy, and I could win. But I was in a very awkward spot because basically I had a Tapu Koko on the board and I had a Weezing. But I needed to promote the Weezing to get enough damage counters into play in between turns to be able to use the Tapu Lele to rearrange damage counters and take a knockout. So that means I'm not going to have a way to freely retreat. And my Tapu Lele is actually in my discard, so I needed to hit a Rescue Stretcher, Escape Rope, and I've already used one, and the Counter Energy off of a Cynthia. And I have the Cynthia, and I don't go for it. Instead, I opted to take, I think, a slightly more conservative play, and I Guzma up a Dedenne GX and smack it with Splattering Sludge, and then just setting up to where I can win on the following turn by bringing up the Dedenne. It forced my opponent to have an additional energy to attach to it to retreat, and they had a Zeraora, I believe, in play with 1 energy, so they would have needed like 1 energy and an energy switch or Thunder Mountain. And at this point in the game, I think my opponent already used several energy switches, so I was thinking, you know what, I could actually catch him on a turn where he whiffs this knockout. But unfortunately, my opponent had, I believe, the Thunder Mountain in hand and a Tapu Koko GX, if I remember correctly. I forget, but he had a way to pull off the knockout there. So maybe in hindsight, I should have just risked it and gone for the Cynthia and tried to hit the Stretcher, Counter Energy, Escape Rope. Hard to say. Either way, I think my odds wouldn't have been that great because I think my deck was still relatively thick at this point too. So just kind of an unfortunate matchup, my opponent having all of these different outs to the Weezing deck. If they didn't play the Double Blower and the Stealthy Hood, I think we would have been in much better shape. So unfortunately, we're taking our first loss of the day to Pikarom. And next up, I get paired against another Reshizard deck, and I'm excited. I'm like, okay, we just took an L to Pikarom, but Reshizard, this is going to be a good matchup for me. But as I come to discover over the course of our games here, this isn't really a normal Reshizard deck. From what I understood, he only played a single copy of Reshiram Charizard. It was a much more Arcanine-centric deck. And that is actually a huge problem because Arcanine is a stage 1, so you don't get the residual damage of Detention Gas. And it also has 140 HP and only gives up 1 prize and hits for 120, which is like the perfect amount of damage to knock out Weezings. So he was just going all in on these Arcanines. He also played Field Blower to blow away my spell tags. He played Max Potion to heal. So yet again, another deck that was very well equipped to deal with this Weezing deck. Again, this is normally a pretty good matchup for me, I think. But playing such a thick Arcanine line, the Max Potions, and the Field Blowers, it's just too much for this Weezing deck to overcome. So I took a pretty convincing double loss here. And so it feels pretty bad. These are normally good matchups, but just the way my opponents have their decks built, they have some serious hard counters to the Weezing deck. I don't know if that was their intention, but either way, the tech options they've chosen here are definitely very good against what I was playing. So I don't really feel bad about these losses because, even though I'm bummed that I have to take these early losses, I'm really not upset the fact that I lost to these decks, though, just because with Double Blower, with Max Potion, yada, 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 all these things that my opponents have been playing, these are things that I probably should lose to. It's not like I'm getting paired against good matchups and playing myself out of a game. So that's the one thing that does make me feel a little bit better. But, we're still 2-2 at this point, and that means I have to win out. I can technically tie one game, but I cannot take another loss for the rest of the day if I want to make day 2. So next up, I get paired against a very interesting deck. It's going to be the Double Muck Tag Team Starmie deck. This is definitely not a deck I was prepared to face, and honestly, even though I initially was kind of excited when I saw them flip over the Muck Tag Team, just because it's weak to Psychic, I started to realize, wait, if they can ever set up this Muck, it can heal 100 every time with its second attack, and I can't really deal with that because Splattering Sludge with a Shrine in play and the ability Detention Gas is going to do exactly 100 every time I attack into this thing. I think that's just really hard to overcome if they can ever get this set up. So in our game 1, my opponent luckily is having kind of an awkward start. They can't seem to find any energy. They find themselves some Starmies and things like that, but they had no energy to actually, accelerate energy to these Mucks because the Starmie has an attack. It's like 1 energy, does 40 damage, and then they can search their deck for up to 3 water or psychic energies and attach them to, I think it's one of their Pokemon, or it might be attached in any way that you like. I forget. But basically, that's their whole form of energy acceleration in this deck. And so because of their slow start, I was able to get a ton of damage counters on the field pretty early on. And they did have some ways to try to counter this. They did play things like Acerola. They played Mix Herbs. So I was actually pretty scared watching them play down all of these healing cards. But again, without energy to really get set up, I was able to just put on way too much pressure, very quickly with my deck just because I had a pretty normal setup. So game 1 actually takes a pretty long time. I actually think my opponent probably should have scooped sooner, just because I think if they do set up, they probably are going to win this matchup. So game 1 basically almost entirely plays to completion before my opponent scoops, and we go on to a game 2. Game 2, however, we get about halfway through the match and then time is called, and there's not enough time left for my opponent to take the rest of their remaining prizes or myself. So game 2 never completed, which means I actually won the whole series, which I was very happy about. I was going to be very upset if my regional run got ended by like Muck Alolan Muck GX. So we're back up to 3-2, which is good. Like I said, we have to keep this streak going because if we do hit another loss, we are out of day 2 contention. But next up, I get paired against Aaron Tarbell playing Nidoqueen, and I kind of knew what I was getting myself into whenever I saw the pairings go up because I sat next to him during round 1, and I saw what he was playing, and the big thing that scared me off is, not only is everything in the Nidoqueen deck not a basic once they get set up, but I saw he played a Solgaleo GX in his deck, which had me really scared because Solgaleo GX, the promo one, it has an attack for just a double colorless energy, heal all damage from all of your Pokemon. So as soon as I got paired against him, I was just super bummed out. Basically, my game plan was, okay, we're just going to let loose and just hope that cripples their setup to where we can overwhelm them with damage before they get going. So in our game 1, I believe he does go first, or maybe I go first, I forget. But either way, on their first turn, they go for Lily, and they, get this huge hand of 8. So on my turn, I play Marshadow to reduce that hand size back down. Oh yeah, and then I did Splattering Sludge. I remember I did initially go first. So that was my second turn, and I was able to get Weezing up and start doing damage and spreading. But my opponent told me after the fact, yeah, his hand was completely unplayable before that Marshadow, which bummed me out. And then after the Marshadow, he was able to set up pretty convincingly. He got, I think, it might have even been like double Meganium Swampert all in the same turn, if I remember correctly. I was like, that was like my win condition, and straight out the window. So, game 1 goes on for a decent amount of time. I eventually do scoop it up. Once he throws down the Solgaleo, heals off all his damage, etc., does some Acerola shenanigans, because he plays Acerola as well, in addition to the Solgaleo. And he plays Palpad and a Rangaroo, so he can recycle Acerola over and over if he needs to. And this is another one of these matchups where I kind of wish I did have a Mr. Mime just to prevent any Acerola shenanigans. It's already hard enough to deal with the Solgaleo GX, but dealing with Acerola on top of that, I think it's just way too much to overcome. Game 2, however, despite how in control my opponent was for the first half of the game, I actually almost made a pretty big comeback. I got down to 1 prize thanks to Honchkrow, because I don't believe I got the Honchkrow set up game 1, so I was able to kind of have a little bit of a surprise factor there, and I was able to knock out their Solgaleo GX in 1 hit with the Honchkrow, and then from there they had already used their Super Boost energy, and they didn't have a Nidoqueen set up. So they really didn't have a good way at dealing with this Honchkrow. I was able to take a couple of knockouts back to back, getting down to 1 prize, but then they were able to set up a Nidoqueen and able to take a knockout at the very end of the game to wrap that one up. So definitely an unfortunate loss I had to take here. If my opponent didn't play the Solgaleo GX line, I think my chances would have been much better, just because Nidoqueen is weak to Psychic and we're spreading every turn. So I think eventually we probably win that matchup if they don't have a way to just heal all of their damage thanks to that GX attack. So pretty unfortunate. My run has kind of come to an end as far as making day 2, but I am still in contention for championship points, because if I win out still and go 6-3, then I can make top 128 and get myself some championship points and, you know, still walk away with something from this tournament. So next up, I get paired against a Zapdos deck, and so I'm feeling pretty good. I'm like, okay, we have another good matchup here. If I can win this one, you know, we're still in it. We can go up to 4-3 at this point and just need 2 more wins after that. So game 1, I won pretty convincingly. I think my opponent scooped it up, you know, probably about halfway through. Game 2, however, I opened Lone Tapu Koko, or no, it was Lone Oranguru, I believe, if I remember correctly, with no supporters and no way to like play down my hand and draw cards. So after 2 turns, I just get benched out, which is like pretty heartbreaking, because again, this is a really good matchup for me. But nevertheless, we still have a game 3 we can go on to. Game 3, however, is a much closer game than games 1 or 2. And honestly, I think my opponent probably would have won this game, but they did make a bit of a misplay. They benched a Gengar Mimikyu GX, which was kind of a cute inclusion that they had there. They already play all of the Rainbow energies to power up some of the Ultra Beasts. So I guess the Gengar Mimikyu is just another type of like backup attacker they could fall back on if they need to. And I don't think they realized it was weak to Dark, because I had Honchkrow in play. And after they put down the Gengar Mimikyu, I was able to Guzma it up, take my last 2 prizes, and then win from there. So I think if my opponent didn't bench that, I think they probably would have won. But hey, either way, I will take it. I desperately needed the win. So now we're up to 4-3 and still in contention for top 128 championship points. Next up, I hit another Reshiram Charizard GX, another matchup I'm perfectly fine seeing. And if I remember correctly, I think we actually only played 1 game, and my opponent had a pretty terrible start. I was able to win pretty convincingly, knocking out his Eevee Snorlax GX and then his Reshiram Charizard GX. I think actually with both Larvitar and maybe Frost Rotom as well. I forget. But either way, my opponent didn't really play too many supporters, and it was a pretty bad game for him. And then he actually scooped in the second game. He knew I was going for my Worlds invite, so he was nice enough to offer the scoop, and probably just didn't want to play after game 1 at that point, I would imagine too. So pretty fortunate hitting that matchup in round 8. So now we're up to 5-3. We just need 1 more win and we can get those championship points. And then round 9, I see I'm playing against Jose Morero, who is a very good player. He just took down, I believe it was Hartford Regionals with Rayquaza GX, if I remember correctly. So pretty accomplished player, very good. And I was immediately bummed out, because I'm like, why can't I play against someone who's like kind of a, you know, maybe just a more average player and maybe be able to get maybe an easier win this way. But we sat down to play. Jose knew I was going for my Worlds invite. And since we were both out of day 2 contention at this point, he actually just scooped the game to me to make sure I could get some championship points. So big shout out to Jose. He didn't have to do that, but super nice guy. Really appreciate it. I found out he was playing Reshizard, so I felt pretty good about the matchup if we did play, but nevertheless, very grateful for him for just being a gentleman and just scooping the game. And after that, that put me up to 6-3. Like I said, that was the goal. That was kind of our backup plan if we whiff day 2. We can at least win out and get some championship points, and that's exactly what I did here. So we finished 6-3. A decent run with the Weezing deck. Looking back at my losses throughout the day, I really don't feel too bad about them. I don't think I played myself out of the games. I kind of mentioned that earlier. These were decks I think that just had like an inherent advantage against the Weezing deck. Like I said, the Nidoqueen playing the Solgaleo GX was just, I think, too much to overcome. The Pikachu Zekrom deck played 3 different outs to dealing with Weezing. The Reshiram Charizard deck played the 3/3 or like a 4/4 Arcanine plus Blower plus Max Potion. Just like these types of things you really just can't overcome, I think, unless your opponent is just drawing poorly most of the time. So even though we didn't make day 2, I still feel fine about the way this day ended. And like I said, happy to walk away with some championship points from this event. So ultimately, I finished 80th, which, like I said, that's within top 128, so that means I did get championship points. But let's take a look at some of the other decks that ended up doing well at this event. So if we look here at the top 8 decks, it's no surprise Reshiram Charizard was dominating this event and took 4 of the top 8 slots. So literally half of top 8 was Reshiram Charizard, which kind of speaks to how good the deck actually is. And we did have a couple of other old favorites, rounding out this top 8. We had a couple of Zoroark decks, we had a Pikachu Zekrom, and then I think the big one that really caught everyone by surprise was the Blacephalon GX deck that Ian Robb was playing, who ultimately wound up winning the entire event, which was probably not what anyone expected this weekend. They all expected Fire to win, but just probably not Blacephalon GX of all things. But definitely cool to see kind of an underdog deck like this still be able to do so well in a format with all these powerful new 3-prize attackers. So overall, guys, pretty happy with how this weekend turned out. Of course, I would have preferred to have made day 2 and be able to keep playing and maybe even get more championship points or, maybe win some money on day 2. But like I said, as long as I walked away with some championship points, I was kind of happy with how my weekend wound up. So at this point in the season, I just need to win a League Cup or like top 64, another major event. And I should be able to round out my Worlds invite. Right now at the time of filming, I do plan on going to Origins and of course Internationals as well, which are coming up in the coming weeks. So between both of those events and some local League Cups that I have coming up, I'm hoping I should be able to round out this Worlds invite and see you guys in DC. So if you guys are going to any of those events coming up, definitely feel free to say hi. I met a couple of you guys actually at Madison. So big shout out to everyone who came up and said hi and, said nice things about the channel and all that stuff. Really means a lot. And really quickly too, guys, because of all the traveling I'm going to be doing coming up, content might be a little bit slow up until internationals. We still have videos planned, but the uploads might be fewer each week than maybe normal. So if uploads do slow down just a tad bit in the near future, just know it's a temporary thing. I just have a lot of traveling I have to be doing. And unfortunately, I have to concentrate a little bit more of my time on play testing, for some of these upcoming events and not being able to make quite as much content. But once I get my Worlds invite, and of course after these 2 major events that are coming up back to back, everything should kind of go back to normal, and we actually should be able to start looking ahead to the Worlds format, which I'm pretty excited for. A lot of people already in the comment section of videos have been talking about rotation, so I'll be happy to finally start to cover some of that. I haven't been able to put too much time into it yet, but I'm definitely excited to finally get the Unbroken Bond standard format behind us and start looking ahead to some of these new cards. And of course, having to build decks in a format with all of these staples that we're going to be losing in the rotation. So definitely be on the lookout whenever all of that content starts as well. But of course, guys, if you did enjoy this content, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you can, consider supporting this channel by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or by picking up some merch from our online store, rarecandytcg.com. It would mean a lot. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.